In this video, we're going to take a look at the eyewitness accounts that witnessed the deaths of Wild Bill Hickok and Jesus Christ. And we'll also check out the eyewitness testimony about seeing the resurrected Jesus from the dead. This is Impact Evangelism. And this is the Disciples Trilemma Part 38. And in this video series, this is an evidential apologetic defense of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Yes, Jesus Christ died for the sins of mankind and rose again from the grave on the third day to give everlasting life to whosoever calls upon his name. So let's define what history actually is. Now, I'm going to just throw away the postmodern definition that history really isn't true or history doesn't exist, that your own truth is your truth and their truth is their truth and you can't know truth and truth is not universal. That kind of postmodern thinking placed upon history doesn't work. So I'm going to define what history actually is. And history is simply the study of past events. Now, I read a lot of history books. Even though I've been preaching for over 20 years, I have more history books than I have theological books. And one of my favorite time periods of history is what historians call the Old West. It's like the post-Civil War era into around early 1900s. And in this time period was one of the most famous persons from that era is what I'm going to talk about today. And his name is Wild Bill Hickok. Now, this guy was he was amazing. He was a lawman. He was a scout for the army. He was a buffalo hunter. He was a spy for the Union during the Civil War, and he was a gunslinger. And so he had a rich, colorful history, and the way he died is pretty famous. So we're going to compare the deaths of Wild Bill Hickok and the eyewitness testimony from the time, and we're going to show how history is done, and we're going to look at the eyewitness testimony about the death of Jesus Christ and his resurrection, and we're going to compare these two historical figures, and just to give you an idea of how history is done. Now, the reference I'm going to use for Wild Bill is Tom Clavin's book, Wild Bill. I just got through with this book recently, and it was a really good book. So if you're into history, I suggest you go buy this book as well. Now, there is a difference between ancient history and recent history. And Wild Bill was around 150 years ago, and Jesus was 2,000 years ago. So obviously the data is not going to be the same. There's not going to be as much evidence from something that happened 2,000 years ago as opposed to something that happened 150 years ago. But I'm willing to guess that you'll be actually surprised at the historical data that there actually is about Jesus. So how did Wild Bill Hickok die? Well, here is the narrative of how he died. On August the 2nd, 1876, James Butler Hickok entered the number 10 saloon at 3 p.m. in Deadwood, which was part of the Dakota Territory. Wild Bill sat at a table to play poker. Carl Mann, Charles Rich, and Captain William Massey were the other card players. Bartender Harry Young was close by this table. Hickok was a big loser in the game and needed a $50 loan from Harry Young just to keep playing. Wild Bill's last words were, "The old duffer broke me on my last hand." Jack McCall entered the number 10 saloon and shot Wild Bill in the back of the head. Wild Bill was motionless for a moment, fell sideways off of his chair, and he died instantly. Jack McCall tried to escape by horse and fell off. That's kind of funny to me. I'm picturing in my mind this desperado trying to flee from his scene of the crime, and he falls off his horse. That's just funny to me. But the eyewitness testimony tells us what happened. Bill's friend, Colorado Charlie, heard shots and ran into the number 10 saloon where he met Ellis Pierce. He was the barber and apparently part-time coroner, because he said that Wild Bill bled out quickly. Harry Young gave chase with many other citizens, and they caught McCall and placed him under guard. And now newspapers and magazines and books published these eyewitness testimonies pretty quickly. And so historians can look back at this eyewitness account of his death, and they can see what actually happened. But there's also some false information that came up around 20 years later. And that false information came from Calamity Jane. Now, Calamity Jane is her story pretty much is suspect all the way through when it comes to Wild Bill Hickok, okay? Don't believe all the movies and things you see about Calamity Jane and Wild Bill. But we're just going to focus on the death of Wild Bill, because there were so many eyewitnesses to this event. We just named them. And so Calamity Jane, 20 years later, made the claim that she cradled Wild Bill as he lay dying after he was shot. And she also claims that she tracked down Jack McCall and caught him herself with a meat cleaver inside of a butcher shop. Now, these two claims are false. And how do we know that they're false? Well, historians can look at the actual eyewitness testimony and see that Calamity Jane wasn't really even anywhere near the number 10 saloon that day. Yes, she knew Wild Bill. That's about as far as it goes. And she did live in Deadwood. But when he died, she was nowhere to be found. None of the eyewitnesses mentioned Calamity Jane at all. And in fact, the stories that she brings up are a contradiction to the eyewitnesses. And all of the eyewitness testimony agrees with each other. And Calamity Jane's, 20 years later, does not cooperate with the other eyewitness testimony. So historians can go back and see the death of Wild Bill and match up Calamity Jane's claims with the actual history, and they can deem that history false. So her claims are false and not historical. And the editor of True West magazine, Bob Bell, actually says that when Calamity Jane died, the people in Deadwood thought it would be a great practical joke to bury her next to Wild Bill. And they also thought it would be good for tourism money, and which it turned out to be. But part of their thinking was that they knew that these claims that Calamity Jane made about other things, but the death as well, about her being there at the death and cradling him as he died and her catching Jack McCall, they knew that was all false, okay? And so they knew that this would be funny to Wild Bill to have her buried next to him as a practical joke to Wild Bill. And they thought that, if Wild Bill could see this, that he would get a kick out of it as well, because they all knew that Calamity Jane was just, making a buck. And they knew that her story was not true. And so this joke to bury her next to Wild Bill is just more evidence that shows that her claims were false. Now we're going to take a look at the eyewitness accounts for the death of Jesus Christ. Now, critics often say that the Gospels are not eyewitness testimony. And I've spent a lot of hours and many videos in this Disciples Trilemma series defending the fact that yes, the Gospels are authentic and they're historically reliable. And they're eyewitness testimony. And so I'm going to give just 5 quick facts to show that the Gospels actually are eyewitness testimony. Number 1, the Gospels are Greco-Roman biography. That is the genre that they are written in, with historical narrative within those Greco-Roman biographies. And this was a common genre of writing in the first century. And it was also quite common for the authors of Greco-Roman biographies to keep themselves out of the narrative. So it's not uncommon to see like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John not saying, I saw this, I was here, I did that, because in this genre, that's not the important thing. The important thing is who the object of the narrative is, and that's Jesus. And so, yes, it's eyewitness testimony, but within the body of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you will not see, hey, I'm Matthew, this is my gospel, this is what I saw. Because that would not fit the genre of the time. But we know by the internal evidence that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were eyewitness testimonies. John claims to be an eyewitness to the events that are in the Gospel of John. You can see this in John 21, verse 24. And you can look at the first epistle of John, and you can see where John again claims that he is an eyewitness, and the other apostles were the eyewitnesses of all that went on with Jesus' ministry, including his death and resurrection. In 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 16, Peter claims to be an eyewitness to Jesus and all the events around his life. And this is important because there was a man in the first century who was a bishop in modern-day Turkey. It was Hierapolis, the city of Hierapolis. His name was Papias. And Papias knew the apostles. He was actually, people think he was probably a disciple of the apostle John himself. And Papias tells us that the Gospel of Mark was basically Peter's eyewitness testimony. And Peter claims over and over in the book of Acts and in 2 Peter to be an eyewitness to all these events. And we know that the Gospel of Mark is eyewitness testimony because it comes from Peter himself. And the Gospel of Luke itself claims that it's eyewitness testimony in the first 3 verses. Right off the bat, Luke says this is an eyewitness testimony account of Jesus Christ. That's what he's saying. And he was a companion of the Apostle Paul, and Paul knew all the other apostles. And Luke probably, I'm sure, got a lot of this information from Paul and from the other eyewitnesses that knew Jesus when he was alive and all these things. So we know that Luke is also eyewitness testimony. And Matthew, the book of Matthew, he was an apostle, so he was also an eyewitness. And so we see that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all of them are eyewitness testimony to the death of Christ and the resurrection of Christ. So now we're going to look at the narrative of Jesus like we did Wild Bill Hickok, and we'll see the eyewitness testimony that is given about the death of Jesus Christ. Fact number 1, the disciples, temple guards, and Roman soldiers witnessed the arrest of Jesus Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. Fact number 2, Peter, John, the Sanhedrin, the high priest, and Herod and his entourage, and Pontius Pilate and Roman soldiers, and probably thousands of people witnessed part of the trial of Jesus. The public part, all of the other witnesses, the crowds that saw, and it was Passover. So there was probably hundreds, if not thousands of people there watching part of the trial where Pilate brings Jesus out to the public. But all of these other people, Peter, John, the Sanhedrin, the high priest, Herod and his entourage, Pontius Pilate, Roman soldiers, saw the whole trial of Jesus Christ. That's a lot of eyewitnesses. And fact number 3, John, Mary, and the women disciples, which numbered around 7, Roman authorities, Jewish authorities, and onlookers, remember it's Passover, and the chief priests and the scribes witnessed the death of Jesus Christ on the cross. That is a lot of eyewitness testimony. And we have primary sources outside of the Bible that tell us Jesus died by crucifixion. We have Tacitus, we have Josephus, we have Lucian, we have Marabar Serapion, and we have the Talmud. These are all extra biblical sources, primary sources that tell us that Jesus died by crucifixion. So, I mean, all these people that say Jesus never lived are just, they don't know what they're talking about. There's tons of evidence that Jesus, yes, he was a real person, and these eyewitnesses saw Jesus arrested, saw his trial, and they saw him die on the cross. Fact number 4 about the death of Christ: Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, and the women disciples, up to maybe 7 women, and the Roman authorities witnessed the burial of Jesus Christ. So to sum this up, that's multiple eyewitness testimony to the arrest, the trial, the death, and the burial of Jesus Christ, ranging from enemy attestation from the high priest, the Sanhedrin, from the Roman officials, Pontius Pilate, Herod, and onlookers and the women. All these people, up to 7 women disciples, all of these people witnessed these historical events about Jesus Christ. You see how it kind of corresponds to all the people that saw the death of Wild Bill Hickok. So history can tell us that both are all historical events, from the death of Wild Bill and the trial, death, and burial of Jesus Christ. And lastly, we're going to look at the eyewitness testimony about the resurrection. Now, in the book of Acts, when all of the apostles preach, Peter and Paul, they all claim that they were eyewitnesses to the resurrected Christ. Jesus died, he was buried, and the apostles all saw him alive. And this was their preaching in the book of Acts. And this was pretty much what they preached. They preached a risen Lord who has ascended to the throne of heaven. That's Jesus Christ. He is the Messiah. He is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And his proof is his resurrection. And all of these apostles claim to have witnessed Jesus risen from the dead. And you can see in the book of Acts, it's in their preaching. And all of these apostles were willing to die for the very fact that they saw Jesus risen from the dead. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to give eyewitness testimony in as close as I can get to chronological order of the appearances of Jesus Christ after his death. We have Mary Magdalene, up to 6 women, 2 disciples, Cleopas and another unnamed disciple, Peter, all of the apostles in Jerusalem without Thomas, the apostles again about a week later with Thomas. We have Peter, Thomas, Nathaniel, John, James, and 2 other disciples. Okay, we have 500 people at one time. 500 people at once Jesus appeared to. And this is mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And Paul even says a lot of these 500 people that saw the resurrected Christ are still alive. Which he's saying, hey, you can go back and check with these people that they saw Jesus risen from the dead. 500 people at one time. Next we have his brother James. And then we have the disciples on a mountaintop in Galilee. And then we have believers in Jerusalem. And for 40 days, Jesus appeared to these believers in Jerusalem. And his disciples saw Jesus ascend unto heaven. And then the apostle Paul was the last apostle to see the risen Christ. That's 13 different appearances, or 11 to 12, depending on how you put some of these together. Some people combine a couple of events, but let's just call it, for the sake of this video, 11 to 13 appearances of Jesus in different places, different groups of people, different numbers of people, ranging from 1 all the way to 500 people at one time. That's the evidence that we have for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the people who witnessed him risen from the dead. So again, we see how historical references teach us about eyewitness testimony and what it means to an historical event. And we've looked at the evidence, the data for the resurrection of Christ, the death of Christ, the burial of Christ, the trial of Christ, the death of Christ, and the death of Wild Bill. We've looked at both, and we see how history is done. And we see there is plethora of eyewitness testimony that says that Jesus died, he was buried, and people saw him risen from the dead 3 days later. Now, one last point. Remember, I'm going to bring up Calamity Jane's testimony here at the end. If you recall, I said that Calamity Jane wrote an autobiography about 20 years after the events of the death of Wild Bill. And her claims are disproven by eyewitness accounts and testimony. And a lot of people will say, hey man, the Gospels were written 40 years after the events. Well, if it was 40 years after, there's plenty of people that still witnessed his resurrection that could verify that it happened. 40 years later is not that far. I mean, in other words, if there were eyewitness accounts that contradicted the Bible, they would have shown up. But they don't, because there is no eyewitness accounts that contradict the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Christ. And Paul, 20 years after the death and resurrection of Christ, wrote a letter to the church at Corinth. And in this book, 1 Corinthians, he talks about the resurrection of Christ. He talks about Jesus visiting Peter and James and all the apostles and 500 people at one time and himself. And all these accounts were written 20 years after the event. He names them by name. That they saw Jesus risen from the dead, including himself. And he even says that, hey, you can go back and check with these 500 people. A lot of them are still alive. You can check with them. And nobody could disprove what Paul was saying. That's just 20 years after the event. Remember, Calamity Jane's false testimony came 20 years after the event, and she was called out because there were still eyewitnesses still alive 20 years later that witnessed the death of Wild Bill and knew that her story was false. The same way when Paul writes 1 Corinthians in chapter 15, there is still plenty of people alive that could have contradicted what Paul said, but it never happened. Because there were no contradictions to what Paul said, because what he said actually happened. Jesus rose from the dead. So we see, just by doing simple history is just the study of past events. That's what history is. And we see from eyewitness testimony, the more eyewitness testimony you can get, the better. Whether it's something that happened 2 days ago or 2,000 years ago or 150 years ago, like Wild Bill's death. But the more eyewitnesses you can get, the better. Did you notice all of the eyewitnesses that saw Jesus risen from the dead? Did you notice all of the eyewitnesses that saw Wild Bill die? There's a lot of evidence for both. And so, historically speaking, the only thing that's keeping people from saying that, yes, Jesus rose from the dead is that they just don't believe in God. That's it. A lot of them, or maybe a lot of people, are searching for truth, and they want to know the truth, and they're not sure if Jesus really rose from the dead, but they would be interested in learning more. This video is for them. But there are a lot of people out there, on YouTube especially, who have their own atheist YouTube channels. Every day, hundreds of hours of material goes out a day to try to disprove Jesus. Saying he never lived, saying he didn't die by crucifixion, saying he didn't resurrect from the dead. But we see that the only thing that's really holding them back is their lack of belief in God. They're predisposed. They can never, as long as they have this hang up about just not believing sound evidence, they're going to remain in the dark because, historically speaking, Jesus rose from the dead. It's historical. There's no way around it. So if you're watching this video and you don't know Christ, surrender to Him today. Believe in who He is, the King of the Kings and Lord of Lords, who died for your sin and rose again from the grave on the third day. Jesus is alive. Repent of your sin and trust Him. He sits at the right hand of the Father today. He rules over His kingdom, and you can become part of His kingdom and be forgiven of your sins. Just trust in Him. And if you're a Christian and you want others to know Jesus and you want to make an impact on this world, what are you waiting for? Go out today and share the gospel.